There was a banned study that was supposed to be stored in vaults, locked forever. However, this study got leaked, and it's related to black DNA. What radioactive it can have is beyond our understanding, and whatever we have been told about black people, their origin, their intelligence, and their capabilities, no one expected the truth to come from a laboratory basement. No one imagined that a forgotten research file, locked away, mislabeled, and quietly buried, could shake the very foundation of American history. Yet here we are. A leaked, unpublished DNA study, dismissed, shelved, and later erased, has resurfaced. Inside it lies a finding so explosive that it sent shockwaves through the small circle of geneticists who saw it. A result so disruptive that some researchers allegedly warned each other never to speak of it again, because the study suggested something unthinkable. Black Americans might not be who textbooks insist they are. Not only descendants of enslaved African, but carriers of a genetic signature that appears in places it should not exist, in ancient indigenous remains, pre-Columbian burial sites, and isolated lineages predating European arrival. The reaction was immediate: panic, silence, suppression, and it forces one question: what did this DNA study uncover so powerful, so politically explosive, that it had to be buried? In this video, let's find out.
The Black History Archives.
For most Black Americans, the official story of their past has been handed down in a straight, brutal line. Africa, ships, slavery, America. It is the diagram you see in school textbooks, the timeline repeated in documentaries, the narrative baked into national memory. Your story begins with capture, with chains, with bodies thrown into the hull of a ship and transported across an ocean to labor on plantations. From there, history moves through emancipation, Jim Crow, civil rights, and the modern era of mass incarceration and racial inequality. It is a story true in its pain, but narrow in its scope. It treats Black existence as something that began when Europeans decided it mattered. What gets erased in that version is everything that existed before the ship. The centuries where African empires rose and fell, where scholars debated astronomy and mathematics, where traders and sailors traveled long distances, and where different continents touched each other long before Europe imagined itself the center of the world. It also erases the indigenous side of the story. The tribal nations in the Americas that had their own complex relationships, conflicts, and alliances, some of which may have intersected with Africans and others in ways that history barely records. That erasure isn't just an accident of poor record keeping. It serves a purpose. If Black people are seen as having arrived in America only as property, then the systems built on that idea, like land ownership, citizenship, racial categories, and legal rights, are easier to justify. It becomes simpler to argue that Black people have no original claim to the land, no pre-slavery presence to acknowledge, no deeper roots to respect. When you define a people's origin as slavery, you quietly deny their prior sovereignty. This is where the Black DNA study steps into the story as something quietly explosive. Unlike school curricula or government archives, genetic evidence doesn't ask for permission before it speaks. It doesn't soften its conclusions to protect national myths. It doesn't bend itself to ideology. However, to understand why talk of a banned Black DNA study causes such shockwaves, we first need to be clear about the current scientific baseline. Within mainstream population genetics, the consensus today is straightforward. There is no widely accepted, robust evidence that large, stable African populations were living across the Americas before Columbus. That doesn't rule out isolated voyages, temporary contacts, or small groups arriving earlier. It simply means that, so far, the kinds of replicated, high-quality data required to rewrite global migration models have not been established to the satisfaction of most experts. But that does not mean the picture is simple or settled. In the 1990s and 2000s, as techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA improved, researchers working on indigenous remains from the Americas began to encounter results they did not entirely expect. A small number of samples showed outlier haplogroups, genetic signatures that did not line up neatly with the typical Native American lineages traced back to ancient Asian ancestors. In a few cases, these sequences looked more similar to patterns seen today in sub-Saharan Africa or North Africa. Officially, many of these anomalies were written off as contamination. Ancient DNA work is notoriously delicate. A single modern cell introduced during excavation, storage, or lab processing can distort a result. From a technical standpoint, calling these cases contamination is plausible, and in some instances, it may well be correct. Yet the speed with which such findings were folded into the category of error without much appetite to investigate further left behind a lingering question. Were these genuinely mistakes and nothing more? Or were some of them quietly dismissed because they complicated an already politically sensitive story? At roughly the same time, a handful of universities generated internal reports or preprints claiming unexpected sub-Saharan signatures in skeletal remains dated to pre-Columbian periods. None of these studies made it through major peer-reviewed journals. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community and we need your support. Let's continue now. Critics pointed to small sample sizes, weak methodology, or poor controls. Supporters argued that, while imperfect, the findings deserve deeper exploration. Behind the scenes, some researchers admitted that even being associated with such a controversial subject could damage their careers. This is the paradox. A study can be scientifically flawed and politically dangerous at the same time. The pressure not to touch it grows, regardless of whether it is true, false, or somewhere in between. Before genetics, physical anthropologists tried to read ancestry from bones alone. In the early 20th century, some claimed that particular skulls or facial structures from ancient American sites showed African-like characteristics. Later scholarship largely rejected these conclusions, arguing that cranial shape is a poor and unreliable proxy for continental origin. Those early debates never completely disappeared. They now hover in the background whenever new evidence hints at connections outside the accepted model. Overlay this with indigenous oral histories, and the picture gets more layered. Several native nations in North America preserve stories of dark-skinned peoples present before Europeans arrived, sometimes described as allies, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as groups eventually absorbed into the tribe. Historians often categorize such accounts as symbolic or mythic, not literal migration records. Yet many indigenous people insist these stories refer to real communities, not abstractions. Put together, all of this leaves us in a complicated middle ground. There are enough anomalies, sideline studies, contested skull interpretations, and persistent oral traditions to make the question deeply uncomfortable. If even a single lineage could be shown with strong evidence to predate European arrival, the consequences for how we understand history, anthropology, and law would be enormous. That possibility alone is enough to make certain institutions nervous, and it is in that climate that whispers about a banned Black DNA study began to circulate. The whispers surrounding the so-called banned DNA study describe a project that examined hundreds of ancient skeletal remains from archaeological sites across North America, dating from roughly 700 to 3,000 years before the present. The study has never been officially released. No peer-reviewed publication exists. The authors have remained silent, and no outside scientist has been given access to the raw sequencing data or laboratory methods. What survives are fragments, accounts from individuals who claim they saw early presentations, internal draft slides, or incomplete manuscripts. These fragments form the basis of three controversial claims. The first claim centers on the Y chromosome, the genetic material passed from fathers to sons. Several of the male remains reportedly carried a lineage known as E1b1a, a signature haplogroup found widely today in West and Central Africa. This lineage is common among sub-Saharan African populations and also among many African-descended communities in the Americas whose ancestors were brought through the transatlantic slave trade. If this same haplogroup were reliably detected in remains that lived centuries before 1492, it would challenge the widespread belief that African genetic presence in the Americas began almost entirely with European transported enslaved Africans. It would raise the possibility that some African-linked lineages were present long before Columbus, something mainstream academic models do not currently accept. The second claim involves mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal ancestry. Some of the ancient samples reportedly contain sequences resembling haplogroups typical of ancient African or North African populations, rather than the lineages usually associated with pre-contact indigenous groups in North America. This finding alone would not constitute definitive proof of pre-Columbian African settlement, especially given how easily ancient samples can be contaminated. But if verified under strict scientific scrutiny, clean labs, replication, and contamination controls, it would support the idea that a small but genuine African-related maternal presence may have existed in certain regions before European colonization. The third key claim concerns geography. The reported genetic anomalies were not scattered randomly across the continent. Instead, they clustered along the Gulf Coast and into the lower Mississippi Valley. These regions later became the homeland of thriving indigenous civilizations, and much later, areas where many native-descended communities were reclassified by government record keepers as colored, mulatto, or black. This bureaucratic reclassification stripped native communities of legal recognition and land rights, even as the people themselves remained physically present. Thus, the genetic clustering described in the alleged study overlaps suspiciously with regions where historical identities were deliberately overwritten. If even a small portion of these findings were validated through rigorous, transparent scientific review, the implications would be far-reaching. It would suggest that some individuals categorized solely as African American today may also be direct biological descendants of pre-Columbian indigenous populations of North America. This would shift their historical identity from being understood only as descendants of forced arrivals to being, at least in part, members of lineages rooted on this land long before European ships arrived. Even without complete proof, the idea alone destabilizes core assumptions about ancestry, belonging, and national origin stories. That is why, according to the Whispers, the study provoked fear, pressure, and a quiet decision within institutions to avoid public scrutiny instead of encouraging open debate. Tell us, if your ancestors weren't just brought here, but were already here, what does that make you now? Does it scare you to imagine that your true origin was hidden from you on purpose? Do tell us. If your bloodline connects to ancient American civilizations, does that change how you see this land? Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.